You probably haven't watched any of the other videos that are on my channel right now, but I've got at least one video on my channel about one of these 200LX palm tops. I'm really fascinated by these things because, if you don't know, these are a full x86 compatible, 186 compatible, PC inside that's powered off of two AA batteries with a CGA display and the keyboard. They're kind of the original palm tops. I really like these things because they're really fun to work on. They've got super long battery life, and you can run full-fledged DOS applications on them. And the fact that this came out in the 90s is really just the cherry on top, because there's a whole community decades in the making surrounding these things. I think that they're super cool, and I've already made a video on my channel about doing double speed mod on the motherboard and repairing the serial port. I've also got a couple other videos on my channel, more or less surrounding this project right here. It's a little bit different. So this is, I don't have a name for it yet, at the moment at least, but this is more or less just a modern incarnation of this, only instead of an x86 compatible platform, it's a Raspberry Pi 4, 2GB inside of here. I'm going to turn it on just to show you. There's a power switch up on this side, and that's a 3D printed battery cover because this case didn't actually come with one. The LCD that you're looking at there is a 4.3-inch wave share LCD that's been pretty heavily modified to fit into the confines of this case. You can see that the case is pretty heavily modified as well. We're loading up Pin right now, which is a multi-boot utility for Raspberry Pis. Right now we've got 3 operating systems installed. One of them is 64-bit Raspbian. The other is Android OS, which actually does work, but it doesn't work with the built-in DSi LCD. It only outputs through HDMI, but it does work, and you can install apps. But, I'm not going to be doing that anyways because there's only a 32GB card in here. And then we also have Kali Linux. We're going to boot into Raspbian. Kali Linux actually makes this into a really, really handy device because Kali, if you don't know, is a utility for sort of pen testing or unauthorized access to different networks, and something that is this form factor. I mean, this is smaller than some smartphones, maybe not as thin, but it's a full-fledged ARM device running full-fat Linux. So it's a really, really cool little device to have something like Kali Linux installed on. So for the pointing device, we actually have it stuck next to the LCD, kind of reminiscent of a Libretto 100 CT or something like that. This is actually a TrackPoint module out of a ThinkPad T60, and these actually run off of straight PS2. We've got that going into a PS2 to USB adapter, and then these wires out here going down into the body of the palm top where the Raspberry Pi is. Now, for some reason, you actually have to have a switch that turns on the mouse after the OS boots. I'm pretty sure that's actually a hardware problem with the Raspberry Pi, because I really don't think that it's software that does that. But you can see, it works. And we get a full-fledged desktop operating system on this. The keyboard is fully functional. Everything is labeled correctly and works the way that it should. Getting this keyboard to run was a project all on its own. I've got a GitHub repository with the software and the firmware that's necessary for this. It basically runs off of a Teensy 2.0 and a custom PCB that I designed. But that was one of the major hurdles of getting this project off the ground. There's really not much to go over in the operating system, save for maybe like a backlight control that lets you control how bright or how dim the LCD is. That's not all that exciting though. This really is just a Raspberry Pi inside of the case. And so it's nothing special. It's really the form factor that I want to show off here. So I'm actually going to turn off the Raspberry Pi, just like that. And quick overview of the I/O. On this side is usually, that is the mouse switch right there that controls 5-volt power to the PS2 adapter that controls the track point. Usually you would have USB, Ethernet, and USB 2.0 on this side of the Raspberry Pi, but obviously it's kind of thin, so a heat gun actually does really quick work of those big, chunky, soldered-on connectors. And this is a single-height USB 3.0 connector. It's really easy. You can connect a mouse and a keyboard if the internal ones aren't working, or a flash drive or whatever. This is hooked up to the internal UART pins on the Raspberry Pi's GPIO that lets you access serial on the Raspberry Pi. And I actually plan on using that on a separate project that I've got coming on later on down the pipe. And then, you know, the normal input-output for a Raspberry Pi, USB-C. I think that's micro HDMI, and then your headphone output there. This is a USB-C for charging. If you look in there, I actually have a second. That's not for charging. That's because these boards that I'm using aren't the best. And then around back, this is the power switch right here that controls the main power. It's literally just switching 5 volts on and off the USB, so there's no like fancy shutdown or anything like that. This is a 3D printed battery cover for one of these 200LXs. Okay, so getting straight into the hardware. The original 200LX was powered off of 2 AA batteries in series. This one is powered off of, well, they're AA shaped. They're 14500 cells, but they're these are just like 18650, you know, 3.7 volt lithium ions. The only difference is that they're shaped a little bit differently, and we've got them hooked up in parallel rather than in series to double their capacity. So that's a little bit different. I'm gonna start opening up this case. I had to actually add a 5th screw post in the middle of the case because one of the posts on my case is actually broken off, or one of the posts that keeps the keyboard in place is broken off. So that helps keep it in place. And just like that. So, I guess what we'll start with is the power, because you can see there, I'm actually using 2 identical boards, and these are some boards that you can get off of AliExpress that'll control a lithium-ion power bank, and it'll output 5 volts. And the reason that I choose these specifically is because they go up to 3 amps, and that is the upper limit for what one of these Raspberry Pi 4s will utilize. So this can run the Raspberry Pi 4 full power, which is great. Now the problem is that whenever you switch these from charging the batteries to discharging the batteries, there's a brief moment where it disconnects the batteries and it actually shuts down the Pi, which kind of makes it unusable in a portable fashion. So the reason that I have 2 is because one of them only controls discharging and powering the Pi, and the other one only controls charging the batteries. So there's no having to worry about switching or anything like that. It's a really, really clumsy approach to doing something like this, but boy, it works. And you can see the one. I actually had to switch up how the batteries were connected internally. That middle post right there originally didn't have a wire soldered to it, but you know, it's in there now. Next up is probably the keyboard right here. This is the keyboard connector, the original for the 200LX, and this is the custom board that I've made that has a Teensy 2.0 soldered directly onto it. Like I said, this was a project in and of itself. I don't plan on making a video about it, but I used kbfirmware.com and a version of what is it? QMK Builder. That's what it is. It's just a custom keyboard firmware, and I had to trace out the convoluted matrix that this keyboard uses, because I don't know why they had to use this keyboard matrix for the original 200LX, but it's really convoluted. So So tracing out this matrix was a real hassle. But once the matrix goes into the teensy, it just outputs standard USB, and that USB gets piped directly into where the old USB 2.0 connectors used to go. This right here is the display connector. I'm using a super long DSI ribbon cable. It's not heavily modified or anything like that, it's just bent in a really particular way to get it to fit inside the confines of the case. On bottom, depends on how you look at it, of the ribbon cable for the display is the ribbon cable that carries the USB signal to the PS2 adapter that powers the TrackPoint module, and that too is plugged pretty much straight into the motherboard through this tack switch right here. The USB 3.0 is simple enough. It's literally just a single height USB 3.0 connector, and these are just a couple of little, I don't know what you call those, push pins that are hooked up directly to, yeah, you can see that there, hooked up to the GPIO. And you can see here the power leads go straight to the 5-volt rail on the Raspberry Pi. It's all very hacky, perhaps a little bit janky, but it works. I'm actually surprised by how solid it works. That's more due to how robust the Raspberry Pi is rather than anything that I did. So like I said, the keyboard was really one of the struggles in getting this whole design to work. The other struggle was probably the display. One of the more unfortunate things about that is that this tube that used to house, let me go and get it really fast. So on the original 200LX, this ribbon cable connected the display to the original motherboard. And I did a lot of work, as you can see, trying to get this cable to work to pipe the USB and display signal up to the wave share display that I'm using, but just didn't. I really think that these leads are just too thin and they interfere a little bit too much. So unfortunately, it really sucks, but I actually had to cut into the case and build in a old school ThinkPad style, I'm not sure what you would call that. It's just a small hinge that the ribbon cable can pass through to give it a little bit of slack, enough to be fully open and fully closed. Let me grab one. A bit like that there. This is a T61 ThinkPad, and you can see that the ribbon cable will flex open, and it really is just a ribbon cable going from the motherboard to the LCD that flexes right along with the hinge. So that's what inspired this solution for the palmtop, and it works fine. I'm a little bit worried about the ribbon cable bending too much and fatiguing over time, but I don't think that's too much to worry about. So the keyboard was one struggle, but I got that worked out. The LCD was another. Like I said, this is a WaveShare 4.3-inch LCD, and these originally come with a glass touchscreen on top. Whenever I got this LCD, the first thing that I noticed is that it was just way, way, way too thick. And so right now this thing is only held in with double-sided tape. Originally it was held in with hot glue. Okay, come on. There we go. So you can see right there, it's a WaveShare LCD. And originally this thing had the PCB, then a layer of double-sided tape, then the LCD, then another layer of double-sided tape, and then the touchscreen on the front layer. And where did it plug in? Right there. Right there is where the touchscreen originally plugged in to this motherboard. Just a quick overview of the stuff that I had to do to get this LCD module to fit. I had to remove the glass touchscreen layer and then remove the foam tape that was keeping it stuck to the LCD. I had to remove the tape that was keeping the LCD stuck to the PCB because it also added quite a bit of thickness, and right now these two are, I think, double-sided taped together. Originally, this motherboard had big fat aluminum standoffs on all of these ground points here, and those came off easily enough with just a soldering iron. And what else? Oh yeah, the original DSI connector. That's the same kind of DSI connector as is on the motherboard for the Raspberry Pi. Had to remove that because it was taking up too much thickness as well. This thing was probably originally 2 or 2.5, maybe 3 times as thick as it is now, and now it is falling apart consistently and held together with hot glue, but it's thin enough to fit inside the case of this 200LX, and just barely. You can actually see on this little lip right here above the keyboard that I had to grind down so gently this part because it was just barely interfering with this bezel of the LCD and stopping it from closing fully. Let's see, what else? I mean, that was the big struggle, to be honest. That was probably the biggest thing that I had to deal with when putting together this thing. And obviously, right now it doesn't have any touchscreen functionality. It is literally just a display, that's it. But, you know, we've also got the USB ribbon cable coming up here to the PS2 adapter, and these 4 wires, just USB. Couple of buttons up here for the mouse buttons, but I've actually got some other mouse buttons mapped to the function row down here. And so, I think with that overview of the hardware, I'm gonna get this thing back together and just really quickly go over the thing one more time. And for those of you that don't know, 70% isopropyl alcohol, any kind of isopropyl alcohol will actually immediately make a hot glue joint let go immediately. Hot glue is by no means permanent, but it can be made very reversible with isopropyl alcohol. Please keep that in mind. It took me so long to figure that out. So, all back together, button back up. One thing that I do want to go over really quickly about the modded cyberdeck Raspberry Pi contraption, like I said, I don't have a name for this thing yet, is that the original 200LX feels really solid. The texture is of plastic, but it doesn't creak, it doesn't make any weird sounds, it feels hefty. I think the LCD on the inside of the top screen actually does a lot for that because it's so heavy and it's so rigid. It doesn't twist really at all. The case feels so solid. It feels really nice to use. Whereas on the device, it creaks and it cracks quite a lot, and it's pretty light comparatively. It's just a little bit disappointing in that aspect, but I think that just comes from the nature of reusing an existing case rather than, building one from scratch yourself. So it's a little bit uninspiring to use, if I'm being totally honest. It really does feel like a project rather than a computer like this one does. But it works. It works. And it really is a very usable device. I like the libretto style pointer next to the display, and I like the position of these mouse buttons up on top of the screen rather than how it's been for a while. Rather than how it is on the librettos, I should say. And the screen is well usable. You know, it can fit in your pocket, just like the original can. One of the biggest downsides for this mod is actually the battery life. You can see that the two original 14500 cells that are in here add up to about 1600 milliamp hours or so. They'll run the Pi for, if you're lucky, like 2 hours. You can do some configuration tweaks to get the power that the Pi uses down pretty low. But you know, the screen, the track point module, even the keyboard uses up quite a bit of power. So you know, if you're really wanting to squeeze as much power as you want out of something like this, you might be able to get 3 hours out of the built-in batteries. But it's really the battery life on this really is pretty pathetic. It's one of the not so good parts of the project. But that's why I spent so much time on the double PCB charging solution, to make sure that you can, you know, use this thing continuously when you're out on the field, as it were. It really is a desktop capable little computer that can fit in your pocket. I hesitate to even call it a cyberdeck, even though that's what I'm going to call it, because cyberdecks are usually these crazy artisan computers that look totally impractical or for a very, very specific use, whereas this is just a relatively useful, if janky, mini laptop. I really like the way that this thing turned out, and hopefully I can use it in a couple more projects in the future, open source it a little bit, and maybe even see some other people attempt something similar. One more thing before we close out of here. The only reason that I did a project like this is because I had a second HP 200LX sitting around with a broken motherboard and a broken display. If that wasn't the specific situation that I was in, I wouldn't have done this project. Sticking Raspberry Pis inside of cases of old computers is something that people used to do a lot a few years back, but if there's any potential for repair of an old computer like this, please, for the love of God, don't gut it and put a cheap Raspberry Pi inside of it. Sell it. Like, send it to somebody to fix. Don't desecrate some older computer that somebody's really willing to buy off of you just because you want to put a Raspberry Pi inside of it. The only reason that something like this exists is because I had a very specific situation with my other 200LX that I was using for parts. So maybe I don't want to see more of these, but I also want to see this developed a little bit more, maybe with a compute module instead of the Raspberry Pi Model B, a better battery solution, and a little bit more integration and a more solid case on the inside of this. That's a ways in the future though. So anyways, if there's any software that you'd like to see demoed on something like this, let me know down in the comments, and thank you very much for watching.